Hello and welcome. My name's Adam Leftick, and I'm a product manager, and I run the Oracle GlassFish Server team here at Oracle. And today we're going to be talking about Maven and doing EJB and Java EE6 development with Oracle GlassFish Server 3.1, which is a pretty exciting set of technologies. So today, one of the things I wanted to cover was first, I think, to sort of wrap your head around this new capability in the product. We'll start off with a quick introduction to Maven um, and setting up a Maven environment, and then we're going to go into developing EJBs with the embedded container within Maven itself and deploying apps within the Maven runtime, sort of directly using the embedded Maven capabilities. Okay, so let's start off with a quick introduction to Maven. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive survey of the Apache Maven product, but it's a sort of high level. So from the Apache Maven site itself, you can see that the way you can sort of think about Apache Maven is a software comprehension, software project management comprehension tool, and it's really based on this project object model called a POM file. And what it really is designed to do is sort of give you a out-of-the-box, quick, up and running build system that also includes reporting and documentation generation, sort of from the central project object model configuration file. So you can sort of easily build. It provides some dependency management, built-in testing and capability. And as well as reporting and project information tooling around, generating a project site. If you haven't used it, it's sort of become I think, the de facto standard for integrated build environments. It does introduce some complexity, but it seems to be well worth the payoff in terms of getting some of these features for free. There is quite a bit of command line tooling that comes with it, the MVN command. There's multiple IDE support, so whether you're using Eclipse comes with you can get a plugin for Eclipse called M2 Eclipse that you can download. It's probably the most popular Maven plugin for Eclipse. We have great support with NetBeans as well as JDeveloper. IntelliJ also provides some integrated Maven. I think NetBeans really is the standard here. They sort of set the bar for how to do Maven development. At least that's my perspective on it. And I'll be using NetBeans throughout this discussion just to sort of show you the capabilities and get up and running quickly with Maven. One of the things that's cool about Maven is it does use these notions of private and public repositories for accessing dependencies, and so this allows you to download jars and publish artifacts into these repositories and get easy access to sort of entire dependency graphs of popular frameworks as well as including Java EE6. One of the big things about Apache Maven that's I think one of the reasons why it's so powerful is it leverages this convention of over configuration, meaning once you really get your head wrapped around Maven, one of the things you'll find is that it allows you to, one of the things it does really well is it basically creates this canonical build system for you, and the only thing you configure are things that you want to change from the default super POM or the sort of canonical versions, and we call those archetypes. So that's kind of a good transition. One of the things that's pretty neat as well with Maven is Maven does have a defined build lifecycle. So each part of the lifecycle that sort of comes, as I mentioned, it's sort of convention of a configuration. There are sort of three primary life cycles that you care about. The first one we call default, which is really does all the deployment. It's really the deployment life cycle. Clean, of course, cleans out projects as well as sort of removes any old state. And then what they call the site lifecycle, which is used for generating documentation. Now, there's different phases of each one of these life cycles, and so borrowing again from the Apache website here, these are sort of the exhaustive list, but the ones that I'm highlighting here is, and we're going to be using, and that most developers, at least I use commonly, is the compile command, which basically allows you to compile the code. And of course, the ones we're going to be using most today is the test and install. Now, the test lifecycle basically is going to, in addition to compiling, it's going to run all your test code as part of the harness. Packaging will take compiled binaries and put them into jars. Integration tests does the deployment step as well. And verifies that the package and any criteria that's part of the lifecycle or part of the phase lifecycle is run as well. And then the one we'll use quite a bit is the install. The install basically takes the package and pushes it into the local repository, and it also leverages any dependency analysis that's part of the local project. And then deploy, of course, is done. It'll push the final package into a remote repository if you have one configured. But again, primarily we're going to focus on the test and install, and maybe clean as well is also something we'll use. Okay, so now one of the things folks struggle with often when you're taking on a new technology is really how do you get started? And this is another strength of the Maven runtime. It's really easy to create a POM/project. And again, they're created from these archetypes, and the archetypes really are these canonical projects. And so there's several canonical projects that you can create. We're going to leverage the jar, which is sort of the most popular and most commonly used archetype. There's a war archetype as well as ear. And what these do when you create a project from the archetype is it generates the POM and the project structure for those. The next sort of step you want to do is we're going to add the plugin and dependencies for Java EE6. And any plugin dependencies, these plugins add additional capabilities to the Maven runtime. And a cool thing about Maven is that it's actually going to download the jar files and add them to your build class path sort of automatically once you define the dependency, and this includes version dependencies as well. Okay. So let's quickly do that. So I'm going to switch over to NetBeans, and what we're going to do is create a project structure. So NetBeans again has great capability. You can do this from the command line as well if you prefer using the MVN command line tool, which I'll switch to just so folks can get a sense for how it's used. And I'm going to create an enterprise application, and you'll see here the description that NetBeans gives you is this Maven Enterprise project template is going to create a parent project, and I'll discuss the sort of project structure a bit more. I'm going to give this a name here, and I'm just going to call this a billing application. And you'll see here one of the things that every project has is an artifact ID, which uniquely identifies the project in a grouping. And these tend to be, by convention, Java package naming conventions. And I'm just going to go ahead and accept these defaults here. And this is where the modules get added, and again I'm going to use the Java EE6 wizard here, and I'm going to create an EJB module called billing EJB and a web module called billing web, and then lastly an assembly module for the ear. And so what this is going to do when I hit finish is it's going to create this project structure and all the necessary POM files or project object model files. Okay, so this will take a few seconds, and it's going to create an entire directory structure that is sort of the convention through which you use Maven, and I'll try to do my best to point out those conventions as I'm using the directories and editing source code. Okay, so what you'll see it's doing is literally running the MVN create, and it's using these archetypes and actually building the system. And then NetBeans is actually going to go ahead and open these projects for me. And so I'll just give it a few seconds while it does all this work in the background. Now I'll sort of switch back to the slides so we can walk through what's actually going to be created, and then I can show you inside of NetBeans. So you'll see billing app is going to be this sort of pairing parent project, and I just called it billing in this case, but now in there you'll see we're going to put common dependencies and configuration. So this is a parent project, and it's very similar to what you have in a superclass, where the child modules inherit any configuration and dependencies that you want to define into the child or the subclasses, using that analogy. So the ear project will package the ear. It's going to contain ear dependencies as well as ear configuration. Any war modules that I've defined called billing app war will also be in there, and it's going to define the packages for the war file, the dependencies for the war, and it's also going to have a dependency on the EJB. So this is how it sort of maps out the entire sort of dependency graph, starting with the ear, working its way down, and then finally we'll have the EJB project itself, which will have a dependency and be consumed by the war project. Okay, so let's go back and sort of look at this in the IDE. So a couple of things. The project file is always called pom.xml, and I'm just going to double click so you can see that. You'll see a bunch of default settings, but one of the things you'll see is the actual group and project name, and then the underlying dependencies that I just described. Here you'll see the EJB, and then the war file are actually going to be packaged as part of the ear. Now note there's going to be a compile time dependency inside the war on the EJB, but a packaging dependency so that the ear file is consumes the EJB module. Okay. Okay. So now let's add some support. One of the things we're going to do is enable Java EE6 support directly inside of Maven. And so there's a couple of things we need to do, and I'm going to just sort of copy and paste these out of the slides here for expediency, and use the Julia Childs approach of sort of pre-baking this for you a bit, so we can focus on the concepts as well as on the steps involved. And here you'll see there's a couple of repositories that we need to add, and the repositories within the Maven system allow you, or basically provide a way to or reference rather, for where Maven can locate the dependencies that are listed in the cases of a jar file. So for example, you'll see I've listed the Eclipse link repo as part of the repository, and then I've added an additional plugin repository. And this is the location of all the GlassFish binaries, and also the binaries and APIs for Java EE6. So this is a way for me to quickly integrate those dependencies into my projects. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that into my POM file here. Okay, and switch it back to the IDE. POM here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put these repositories into my parent project so that this can all be quickly consumed. And this goes into the pom.xml file for the overall project. In that way, all my sub-projects will be able to quickly locate any dependencies that I define in there. Okay, so let's go back. So this is one of the steps. And then the other thing we need to do is add some of the dependencies. And so I'm going to add these directly into my EJB project. Property that basically points to the embedded GlassFish jar, which is going to allow me to run GlassFish inside of Maven. And we're going to use this later, but for the purposes of sort of just interacting with this configuration file up front, I'm just going to go ahead and add that in there in the beginning. And this I'm going to refer to later in my dependencies. So now I'm going to switch back to here, and now I'm going to add in all the dependencies and talk you through each one of those real quick. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a bunch. And so one of the things you'll see, the first one is I'm adding the dependency for the embedded container. You'll see that JUnit was added by default, and the Java EE6 actually was already there as well, so I'll just delete that one out. And so Java EE6, you can see here is denoted by the artifact ID as Java EE API, and the group ID is JavaX. And so that includes all the JavaX, enterprise, including all the JavaX, servlet APIs as well. For example. Now I've also added the Eclipse link support through org persistence, and note the scope is called provided, and what that means in Maven terms is that at runtime this jar will be provided by something else, so I don't actually want it packaged in any of the packages that I'm using. And then of course the path to the GlassFish embedded static shell jar is going to use my property that I've defined up here. And that's just a natural way of doing that. You can override these through -ds when you run Maven, as well as like environment configuration files. So that's a nice way of basically doing that quickly. So now what I'm going to do is just sort of test my overall POM file, and I'm going to switch back to this command line here, and I'm going to cd into my projects. So I'm going to just do a quick LX, and you'll see I have a billing. You can see my project structure there, and I'm going to cd into my billing EJB directory, and then I'm going to run the mvn clean install command just to sort of validate that my environment's working. And this is, for those of you who've never seen Maven before, this is pretty typical output where you see the project as well as the tasks in terms of life cycles and phases that it's executing. The build successful is always what you're sort of keeping your eye out for down here, and that just tells me that right now my packaging is working well, and the compilation is all executing properly. But we'll find out that the dependencies were picked up when we start adding some software code there. And let's go back to the slides real quick. And I think that's basically the next step that we're in. So now what we're going to do is basically start building our JPA module. And so a couple of the steps that you want to sort of walk through for testing and building a JPA-based EJB service. So the first thing we're going to do, and this is pretty amazing because you'll see how easy it is to get all this up and running really quickly and easily with NetBeans and GlassFish. But the first thing we're going to do is start the database, and you have to have a database for JPA. And the next thing we're going to do is map the entity, and this is using a simple JPA entity command. Then we're going to implement the stateless session bean service that'll just use to create a basic service facade on top of a JPA entity for some CRUD operations. Then I'm going to just implement a quick JUnit test case to validate that my entity is mapped properly to my tables, as well as, test my business logic as well. Then you just simply run it within Maven, and you'll see some magic. What's going to happen is the GlassFish container is going to be instantiated, and the module, the JPA entity module, is going to be deployed to it, and we're going to bind. You'll see I'm not going to provide any endpoint information. What will happen sort of behind the scenes is that there's a default data source that lives under the JNDI name JDBC underscore default, which is backed by the Derby pool connection pool inside of the embedded runtime. And that's going to connect up to the Java database that I started in the first step, running on port 1527, using the JavaDB database on app server samples, using the app schema. So that's sort of what's going on behind the scenes as I'm doing this. Sort of keep in the back of your mind all the magic that GlassFish is performing on your behalf to sort of make this easier, and it'll help you understand all the mechanics and machinery that's going on behind the covers, or under the covers rather. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a couple of EJB source files here, and I'm going to use the Julia Childs approach as well. I've already prepared these so you don't have to painfully watch me type, but I'm going to start off with this POJO entity called the service bill, and this is going to be my basic JPA class. So let's create a new Java class here. I'll hit finish. Now I'm going to copy all the code here. Copy. All right, I'm going to save this file and just talk you through it real quick. So we have a service bill. It's going to use a generated value for the primary key, which is a property called ID. That's the primary key. I have a provider name, which will default. A couple of dates. One, a bill is going to have a date of service as well as a due date, and then some description for the service. So a fairly simple notion of like something you would get in a household bill, like a service bill, for example. Okay, so then now let's implement some sort of service kind of implementing service interface. We'll just create a Java class using that same model package. We'll just call it, see what I called it in this class, billing persistence service. So we'll just switch that out here. And I'm going to go ahead and click finish. Copy and paste that code. Oops. Go ahead and save that file. Okay, so now here I'm going to inject my billing persistence. I'm creating a name called billing persistence unit. I'm going to have a couple of methods for adding and removing a bill. It's quite straightforward. I'm going to just implement add bill by calling persist and then returning the ID from there. And then remove bill, which basically is going to do an EJB find and then remove it. And note, I'm going to use the transaction attribute required here. And unlike previous versions, like in Java EE6, for example, where you basically had to, deal with the differences between the Java EE programming model when you're running inside of the container versus running outside the container. You'll see here I'm able to run my JUnit tests using the same declarative sort of annotation-based transaction demarcation. And so let's sort of prove that out. So now what I'm going to do is create a new test case by going into my test package, and I'm going to create a new Java class. And let's see, let's call it using my Julia Childs here. Let's see what I have. Service bill test case. And we'll keep that same package as well. Okay. Oops, I'm going to select everything out of here and copy and paste. For those of you, I assume most people are pretty familiar with using the, oops, I did use the default package. I'll have to move it. Hold on, just remove this rather. One of the things you'll find if you're not familiar with JUnit is it's really easy to basically implement a test case by using these annotations. In this case, I'm using the extends test case, and I'm going to show you a couple of things, and there's some reasons why I would do this. Because if I were building a, well, actually I need to add that import because I moved the package by accident here. Let's see. So we'll just go ahead and add that in there. And this import. Okay. And whoops, I got a misspelling there. So a couple things. In the setup method, you'll see what I'm going to do to provide sort of the embedded runtime, or sort of indicate to JUnit that I need the embedded runtime, is I'm going to basically create a properties object or a map of string objects called props, and in there I'm going to put the app name, and I'm going to set that to build tracker EJB. Then the next method you'll see here is EJB, static method called EJB container.create EJB, and you pass in the props, and that'll give me back a member that I'm going to store called container. And at this point, what's going to happen is the Maven runtime is basically going to invoke this test case. It's going to run my setup method, and then it's going to start iterating through my test add bill and then test remove bill commands. Now, before it does that, you'll see here that the full EJB container is already working, and this test case assumes it's working rather. And you'll see in here it's basically going to look up in JNDI just like you would when you're running as a sort of Java EE EJB. I could also be doing dependency injection if I wanted, and I'm going to call the teardown method as well. And in this teardown method, I'm basically going to close down the container and clean it up. So let's see how this actually works in practice. So I'm going to just switch back to my Maven command, and I'm going to run Maven clean and Maven install again. And this is going to sort of clean my project, and as part of the install lifecycle phase, it'll invoke the test command after it's done compilation, and you'll see it's automatically going to detect my test case and run them. You can see now it's running the service build test case, and you'll see that it's basically automatically starting up the GlassFish Server Open Source Edition in embedded mode. It's deploying my application right now. And once it's done deploying, it's going to execute my test case, and you can see I had a test failure. Well, what happened? Let's see. I had an exception during that. The service method long, add bill, there was an EJB exception, and one of the proxy failed. And so, you can see here already that the EJB container has executed my method. Now it's going to basically start tearing down the runtime environment. You can see here I had a couple errors. So it failed on both add bill and remove bill. Now, one of the cool things about this is that you'll see it'll give you a log file here if you want to go and look and see what actually was the exception. You can paste that in, and then you'll see I'll have a text file version of the report by default, as well as the underlying error message. Okay. Now, one of the things I said very early on was we had to do a couple of other steps. So a couple of things, I didn't start the database, but I also didn't provide my persistence XML with the following persistence billing unit as I annotated it. So you'll see in here under my billing PU, there was no way for it to inject because I haven't created the persistence unit. Now, one of the areas that Maven provides the resource files in a separate directory structure is under this meta-inf directory. So I'm going to create a new XML document here to fix my exception. Whoops, new. And I'm going to call this persistence. And I'll just click finish. And of course, I've already had that pre-baked already, so I'm just going to copy and paste this in. Note there's a couple of methods. Whoops, let me just replace that. Note there's a couple of things I've added in here. One is that I want to generate the tables. So every time I do a deployment, I want it to draw and recreate the tables, and I want it to do it right on the database. Now remember, I'm going to get another failure unless I start up the database. So I'm going to do that from within NetBeans. So I'm going to just right click and hit start server, and Derby's up and running. Okay. So now let's rerun our test case now that we fixed a couple of the errors. Let me just make sure I save that. Oh, I did. Okay, good. So now let's see what happens when we rerun the mvn clean install command. So you can see it's cleaning up the old resource or the old build directories by default. You have /target. Now you can see it's running my tests again. Deploying my application. You can see Eclipse link being deployed as well and starting up, and sure enough, I can tell my test case has succeeded because the container is being shut down without any exceptions flying across the screen. But if I had some business logic failures or something like that where my assertions weren't being met, that would all be quite normal for this sort of iterative development. Now you can see I have a completely successful build, and I have test reports that, again, I can sort of look in here. Let's see. You'll see my successful report. Whoops, right there. And sure enough, if I wanted to use that, it tells me how long it took. Pretty cool. So you can see, like, this is really easy to do iterative development with Java EE6 and Maven using GlassFish with NetBeans as well. So now, switch back to my project, and then I'm going to go back to the slides here just to sort of remind folks. So there was quite a bit of magic. It seems rather elegant, or rather hidden, that all the things that GlassFish is actually doing for you, but it's worth sort of enumerating through them. Okay, so we did that. Now, let's take this same application and actually deploy this directly within Maven. Instead of running the embedded EJB container, let's actually take our EE6 and drop it directly in there. So one of the things we can do with GlassFish is it has this integrated Maven plugin. The plugins themselves can be configured to deploy directly to GlassFish within a given lifecycle phase. So you can determine what that lifecycle phase, and this gives you the ability, again, to deploy without ever leaving the MVN command, and redeployment is sort of a simple keystroke. So how do you go about doing this? What you do is you configure the POM file to basically bind the plugin to a phase and configuration for the GlassFish settings. So now you can override quite a bit of GlassFish settings within the plugin configuration. So here you'll see I basically providing a different port as well as a context path for my application. And this again is going to run, in this example, I'm running the web app. So let's just go ahead and copy and paste this in, and we'll also be closing with this. So now I'm going to switch over to my web application. So go to my web app here. Oops, it's open already. Let's close these down so it's easier to see for me. And sure enough, it's down here. And this POM file is going to be right there. And so we're going to add this into the build plugins. So I'm just going to go within here, and voila. Okay. Now this should enable my building web to basically run and install. And so just a quick peruse of this index.jsp file. So I should be able to see this hello world web page right off the bat. So let's now go deploy that. So I'm going to go upper directory, do mvn clean, and install. Now it's going to do everything from the parent. And iterate through all its children. That's one of the things you'll see in the EJB file. Test cases are going to be run first. That's part of the overall install command because it's a dependency. And this is nice if you're doing, you want to make sure that before a deployment occurs in, say, a test environment or an integration environment, all the test case pass. If it were to fail, you could basically fail the build at this point. But mine should pass. And then you'll see what's going to happen is when the web project gets built, it'll actually run inside of the container and deploy our application. Okay, so we have a successful. Now it's building the web app. You can see it actually building the class path. And right within Maven, you can see GlassFish being started up, and the container is almost up and running and deploying the web app. Now I'm CPU bound because I'm running a lot of things on this Mac, but normally it's much quicker. So now I should have GlassFish running on this port 888 with a bill context path, and then we'll go ahead and just test off this JSP. So let's give it a shot. HTTP here. Whoops. You can see my localhost 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's try this out. You can see I've tested it before, and sure enough, you can see that I have a hello world page popping right up, and this is all running. Note I've never really left the Maven command, and if I wasn't using the IDE, I can do that as well. Just to show you how dynamic and interactive this is for development, I'm just going to go ahead and change this file here and save that off and go ahead and refresh. And sure enough, you can see that the JSP was recompiled. Now, you can see here if I were to make code changes and recompile within, say, another console, and I hit the redeployment command, it'll actually redeploy the entire application through that simple command. And it's really, really powerful. Now when I'm ready, you're sort of done through your iteration, you can just go ahead and hit X, and it'll actually continue on with the build and terminate. And sure enough, if I were to switch back here, I don't have another page listing because I shut down the server. Okay. Well, so with that, I mean, I'm not sure we could have gotten it much easier, but this is sort of the really straightforward way of enabling the Maven deployment right outside of GlassFish. So, well, thank you so much for watching this and listening to me. And if you have